un channel en vue de l'obtention du titre de docteur en sciences de l'Université de Strasbourg. Vous disposerez d'environ 40-45 minutes. Et donc ensuite, ce sera suivi de questions qui seront d'abord posées par le rapporteur, Monsieur Marc Baden, directeur de recherche au CNRS, qui vient de l'UPC à Paris. Monsieur Mounir Tarek, directeur de recherche au CNRS également, qui vient de l'Université de Lorraine, notre directeur de thèse, Monsieur Marco Cecchini, et moi-même, professeur à l'Université de Strasbourg. Je vous en prie.
In French, I will do for English. So first of all, welcome to my PhD defense. Before we start, I would like to thank the jury for accepting to judge my work and for being here today. So during the next 42... Thierry, apparemment, le volume n'est pas top. Is it fine right there? Okay, they say it's fine, so so during the 40 to 45 next minute, I will try to tell you about my work, what I've done during the 3 years of my doctoral research under the supervision of Marco. My thesis was entitled Allosteric Modulation of Pentamerically Indicated Ion Channel from the Jiggling of Atoms to Pharmacological Strategy. I'll just yell. I think it's on, just will it stop working with the microphone? Okay, so before we dive into the detail, let me introduce a bit the subject. So we'll go for a wide introduction. Why is it a biological relevant question? Why are we trying to tackle it? And what is the subject? Then we'll talk about the gating mechanism, the allosteric modulation, and we'll finish with concluding remarks. First, introduction. So throughout evolution, organisms evolved and created the need of a nervous system. And this nervous system is basically composed of many neurons. And these neurons, as represented here and here, allow the communication between, in human, the brain, and a distant site, could be a muscle cell, could be a gland cell. And in this case, the first neuron will emit a signal that will be passing through the axon and will reach the second neuron. When it reaches the second neuron, there is an interface here that is called a synapse. And the synapse here will allow for the communication between the two neurons. The first neuron will actually secrete some neurotransmitter that will be recaptured by the second neuron here on some receptors, so neuroreceptors. And these neuroreceptors can be of many different types. And today we'll focus on also composed of another the first outside the cell and it comes from the outside of the cell and different binding sites to represent the food and some features that we'll be discussing later on. And the M2 prelude that we'll be discussing more later on. If we now focus on the ion channel here, so here represented the M2 helices in blue, and the channel is going in this direction. Those are ion channels, so they're meant to terminate ions. Here is represented the choke point, or the constriction point. Any better? No? Okay. Whatever. So here is represented the choke point here, and this choke point is basically the gate where the channel will be closed or open. We can now talk a bit about the members. So this is a family including several different types of receptors. And here we have divided in human and non-human members of the family. In the human members, you have the well-known nicotinic acetylcholine receptor here. You also have the serotonin receptor, the glycine receptor, and the GABA receptor type A. If you go for the non-human, you have GLIC, ELIC, and gluceal. Both two here are from prokaryotic organisms. And this one was actually the first structure of an eukaryotic homologue that was ever elucidated in 2011. And as you can see, and for technical reason, mainly prokaryotic receptors, the non-human receptors, are usually elucidated before the ones that are human here, and according to the date selection. So how do these receptors work? And the question is, how do they perform the function? And we can describe this based on two different models. So there is the induced fit that I won't be talking about today, and the conformational selection. So this one is the one that is the most widely assumed in the community, and that seems to be the most adequate for describing what happens in the PLX. So in this model, we assume that this receptor pre-exists in two different states. So the active state and the resting state, in which it is respectively closed, open or closed. What happens is that after some time, random fluctuation will create a state that is actually permeable to ions, and the binding of the neurotransmitter will stabilize these states against the resting state. So the active state will be selected by the neurotransmitter, and this will allow for the formation of ion through the membrane that is presented here. Eventually, after some time, the channel will go to desensitization, and this is desensitization can be seen as a cramp of the channel, because actually it's still activated by the receptor, but it's no longer able to open. And the final loop, that's why they're very interesting. The one or the orthosteric ligand. And the orthosteric ligand is the native ligand, the one that in the body will, for example, acetylcholine for the nicotinic acetylcholine receptor will bind in this location, so any other site will be an allosteric site. And these allosteric ligands can be of various types. They can be either agonists, where they will on themselves potentiate the receptor, so activate the receptor. They can be antagonists, and then they will block the activity of the receptor on themselves. Or they can be so-called PAM and NAMs, as we will be discussing in more detail later on, meaning that in the presence in a receptor that is already activated, they will either increase the response for a positive allosteric modulator, either decrease the response for negative allosteric modulators. So these are key concepts because we will be discussing them in much more detail later on. So now we've seen how these receptors work. But what happens when they don't work properly? What happens when there is a dysfunction? And actually a lot of different things happen, because those receptors are crucial for the normal functioning of the human brain and the human body in general. So the first we'll be discussing is the Alzheimer's disease. And actually it was described by Dr. Alzheimer in 1906, and it's the first cause of senile dementia. It is due to an hypercholinergic tone, so basically you have too much acetylcholine in your brain, or is one of the reasons why one of the reasons you have Alzheimer's is this one. And actually we have very few treatments. And most of them are targeted to regulate the level of acetylcholine in your brain. And the treatment that we have are not efficient, but they're efficient for a small amount of time, and they're not efficient in so-called juvenile type of Alzheimer's disease. So there's a huge lack of treatment for this disease. And the second one that we can mention is Parkinson's disease, that was described a century before by Dr. Parkinson, and that is the second most common neurodegenerative disorder. That is basically due to an imbalance between the dopamine and the acetylcholine tone in the brain. Basically, the dopamine will downregulate the secretion of acetylcholine, and Parkinson is associated with a lack of dopamine. So less dopamine means more acetylcholine, and basically the more acetylcholine is responsible for some of the symptoms of Parkinson's disease. And at the moment, we have no curative treatment. So again, there are some treatments that work for a small amount of time, and then we don't have anything. And these are not the only diseases that are involved in those channels. You have a bunch of them here, and even more than that. We're discovering every day. So there is a lack of treatment, and that is the reason why we should keep working on those diseases, and we should try to improve and propose new strategies. But you will tell me, why would one be interested in designing an allosteric ligand more than designing an orthosteric ligand? And the reason is very interesting. Actually, the protein. And because of that, the variability of the sequence of amino acid is much more diverse and much bigger. And because of that, we can be very subtype specific. So we can actually design a drug that ideally would have no side effect, but would have all the effects that we're looking for. So we can be subtype specific, and some of them, as we've talked before, are PAM or NAMs, so they can only act in the presence of the natural activator. And because of that, their effect is much more gentle. So in cases where we're talking about neurological disorders or psychotic disorders, it's very important to have a gentle modification, because usually it's a gentle imbalance. So here is the problematic. The big question we'll try to answer, and actually that I tried to answer during my PhD, was how do these molecules work? How do PLGs work? How can the binding of the ligand at some places on the protein lead to the opening or closing of a channel? How is this possible? And once we understood that, or we proposed a solution for that, we'll try to understand how can a small molecule modulate this effect. How can the binding of the ligand can modulate this response? So the weapon of choice to address this question was molecular dynamics simulation. And because, well, for several reasons. First, it allows you to sample a trajectory, and nowadays we can sample a long trajectory of a full system of all the atoms of the full system. So you can access the thermodynamics, the energetics of the system, some things that you cannot do as accurately in experiments. And UCL is bound to glutamate here, so the blue sign, and in the transmembrane domain is bound to ivermectin, that is actually a drug used for scabies and some worm infestation. So we went for UCL, and in order to reproduce the biological environment, we added water ions and also here bilayer POPC membrane that is reproducing somehow what's a cell membrane. And well, I should mention also that when we started, we had only the active structure of UCL, so the open structure of UCL, which was published in 2011. So before we can start discussing the results, I need to introduce some of the quantities that we're going to have a look at, because what is very important when you're doing simulation is that you cannot just watch simulation. You have to measure quantity. You have to assess the evolution of the transition or something that you're looking at. And to do so, we designed several observable, or we used several observables, such as the twist, which is basically a clockwise rotation of, well, this is a top view of the protein, just in case, and it's the clockwise rotation of the protein. It is measured in degree, as it is an angle, and we've also defined the blooming angle, which is there, a radial orientation, so... And now we will focus on what happened at the level of the ion channel. So when you twist, you move that upward and outward, and you move that part inward and outward. And this is responsible for the closing of the pore at the level of the level of the choke point, or the constriction point, right here. And actually, just to finish, well, this all this work was published earlier this year in a PLOS CV paper in what was it, September, I think. I don't exactly remember, but just earlier this year. So now we've talked about two different ligands. So the orthosteric.
Count together 6 microseconds. So I was somewhere missing a microsecond. No,
well, that's possible that I was mistaken in the count. I think it's 2 times 2.5, so it makes 5. Well, I know that because initially when I counted, because there were some simulations that are not there, that I didn't discuss because some simulations are actually repeats of the open simulation. And it was about 600 nanototal. Probably the effect of the gradient was not really important for looking at the deactivation of the protein, although it would have been very interesting to do so, and it was done so by Adrien in the lab.
It was obvious, so it was a good job, I think, to get the essence of what you did in the time. So I mean, I made already some comments on the manuscript. I will not get back to this. Mostly just maybe some of the typos were a bit hindering the good reading, and maybe some details were missing to fully understand exactly what you did. So that's also why I start by asking for a few more details, for instance, on the simulation setup and on the choices you made. First, could you comment, I mean, you already mentioned about the cholesterol and the possible sensitivity to the membrane composition. But your choice on membrane composition and sensitivity to the lipids for this particular channel?
Well, I mean, we wanted to try several composition of different membranes. The problem is that you have to come up with a membrane that is somehow equilibrated already, and you have to equilibrate that membrane around the protein. Because you would have to either bind those ligands yourself into the membrane or let them relax long enough for them to spontaneously bind the receptor. That is a very challenging protocol or question to tackle, and we didn't go for it this way, but I mean that's very important. The composition of the membrane seems to be changing a lot, the effect of the receptor, and even slight composition of the membrane, either because it changed the physics of the membrane, either because it specifically bind in some sites. And we didn't go in this direction apart from the last end where I tried to see the effect of cholesterol, but in the MD simulation that I ran, we just went for straight POPC.
And so that motivation of pure POPC, is it related to experiments or just because computationally it's a standard way to do things?
Yeah, well, computationally it's a standard way. It was what was developed in the lab, and what I came into was POPC, so I went along with POPC.
Okay.
They can provide that to experimentally so they can try. But the final idea of this whole study was actually to screen the database and have a cheaper version of that algorithm and try to see what kind of ligand would be, what moieties, what framework, what the skeleton of the molecule that would be active. That was the idea of that method.
And I would say from my reading of the piece that probably one of the arguments is that if you block the twist at about angle 22, then it should stay active. Right?
Yep.
So if you find a way, crossing or whatever, that stabilizes this, that could be something people could test.
Yep.
And so, more generally speaking, the observations you make, to what extent do you think they are specific to UCL or generic to the family?
Well, that's a very good question, because usually when we're working on UCL, we go for it should be applicable to the full family because there's the same structure, but we know it's very different. And we've seen in several papers, some of them that you published, where the mechanism is different based on if you're looking at ELIC or GLIC or the prokaryotic receptor or the human receptors. We're missing the intracellular domain in the human ones, so even that could be really making a lot of difference. So, and to be honest, I don't know how it could be applied to the other system, and it would be very interesting to apply this framework of analysis to our own simulation of of the new structure that came out of the human receptors, the GABA receptor, the glycine receptor, and so on. And I know that we've already measured some of the twisting role of the glycine receptor, and we've seen that the value was similar to the active state of UCL. So for the mechanism, I don't know if it would hold, especially because for the beta expansion that I was mentioning in the thesis, we absolutely don't see it in those simulations, and we even see that they go closer and closer, so that the beta expansion is more of a beta contraction when we deactivate the receptor. And since you have slight differences between all the members of the family, I would expect slight differences in the mechanism. But for example, those big motion like the booming and the twisting, I think they apply to all the receptors. Maybe with the molecular details changes though.
Okay. Very last question. If you had to start again now, would you do anything very differently, or would it be the same?
Well, it's a tricky question. Yeah, I think I would do lots of stuff differently because now I have the knowledge that I didn't have before. And yeah, there's plenty of stuff that I would do differently. And well, I won't give you a list because it would be pretty long. But For example, one of the things you mentioned, I would really try to have more observable that can be compared with experiments, because I think it really gives strength to what we claim in theoretical approaches. So that would be one of the things I would try to improve.
Thank you.
Effectivement, on va aller jusqu'à ce que le microphone puisse correct le level.
All right. Well, thank you, first of all, like Nicolas, for inviting me over as a few months ago, maybe 1 year ago, as a member of the, I don't know how you call it, the midterm committee, which already gave me a flavor of what you were doing, and I was already pleased to start understanding some aspects of the work that you have been doing, and specifically this membrane protein. So as same as Mark and we are in this club of people who use simulations to try to help the experimenters understand, as Mark really pointed out, your last sentence was not really welcome in the community because we don't want to be substitute experimentalists, but we want to help them out because that's where the whole science comes from. So the idea is to give them ways of interpreting their data that they didn't think about, that it's we are far from being in any other field. Going to supplement, if we are doing like a nuclear research maybe because we want to avoid some experiment, but in this here it's so complex, and it's so complex, and I will try to let you really understand why. So first of all, the overall remark, this is a very interesting piece of work. There is no doubt that at this actual state of knowledge of these systems, what you brought to the table is very important, very interesting. It will give people some clues about where to start looking and why. We don't know yet exactly if this can be generalized and what do you do with all these results, but at least for this specific protein, there are things that come to light. So you compare them basically also in your talk historically to what has been done from simulation. I was missing something. It's like what experimentalists are saying.
Yeah.
Do they at least accept the input from people doing modeling, or they have their own models? Do they fit in there or not? So this is maybe a discussion that we will have. But since we are only 3 people, I will take all my time to go through what I would think is a real examination. So what I would like to do is to ask questions. Was this a really hard work to do or not? We have all our views. I think most of the time, yes. Was it well done? Most of it, because the results sounds interesting. You have prepared them to some experiments, so that we can still go to the details. And then the rest is that what do we do with that? So I don't know where you want me to start, but let's see for the basics here, right? You try to, even in your talk, to explain to us why is it important to look at this at the molecular level, right? So other scientists are working on other aspects of this protein. And you mentioned Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's disease, but the way you did it is that it sounded like the issue was really lack of access of minors, right? It has nothing to do with the fact that do we know how if it's working or not at the molecular level. So I know that some treatments for Parkinson's disease is indeed to provide dopamine, but we don't need to know exactly at the molecular level how these receptors are working, right? So that was one aspect. There are probably some others that maybe you will not devoting enough time in your presentation, but the idea is that if we know exactly, which is your second part, if we know how it works, and when we can design modulators, that's why the molecular level is really interesting. The second part is that I told you that I think in the midterm community, were you just lucky enough so all these things could happen within so cheap computation? I mean, in terms of what we can do today, which is few microseconds and that's it, you got it, you know how it works. Was it just a well-behaved protein? Is it general or not general? And this is a really very important aspect, even before we start looking at the calculation. So let me first go to a list of items that are in your thesis, for which some of them I have some critiques, some of them I have some real questions, right? Because we want to be able to repeat what you did, to learn from it for other systems. So maybe you didn't have time enough to expand on your manuscript on describing, but this is something that is very important for people who are coming after you and try to use your knowledge and experiment. Some other stuff, it looks like it's a very difficult task, because when you do modeling of these systems in multidisciplinary, you need, or at least we ask you to be expert in every detail. I could foresee in your manuscript that sometimes maybe you were too fast to write stuff that was probably not correct, but this is not acceptable from you as a scientist. But this, it happened to all of us, right? So I want to ask you, but some of it is really simple, like when you say page 47, you use reversible RESPA for multiple time step. Why does that? It doesn't exist in MD. MD uses Langevin dynamics, and reversible RESPA is a specific algorithm that uses time reversible reference system propagator algorithms that is not implemented in there. So you did use indeed multiple time step, but in a way that Langevin dynamics could, or MD people could implement that. So you see, this is something, it's just a simple sentence, it's a confusion between multiple time step and the fact that it was implemented, and you should immediately avoid that, right? There are other, along the same line, right?
I mainly focused on what was published by X-ray experiments, and X-ray experiments were assessing the relevance of the twist and also the existence of the blooming, and also the decoupling of the M2 and M3 helices while release closing, and all this kind of stuff were actually compared with experiments with X-ray structures.
Right. Maybe a couple of other questions, because the last part was also very, very interesting. So then you scanned a myriad of PAMs and MABs and so on. Can you tell me one example, because you didn't describe at all, for someone who doesn't know the methods, the docking calculation, the scoring functions. So we find a table with 140, 139.6, and I have no idea what to make of it. I mean, you probably did it correctly, but there was no insight about how we could read it with before science. So if you take the table with cholesterol, right, and it had a series of numbers, so which one you take, the highest, the lowest? It's a negative value. What's the difference? Are these differences? Because you said they are all in this IEM site, but what's the difference? Is the conformation?
Well, there was slight differences in the position of because the ivermectin site is a cleft.
Right.
So you can be either outside the cleft and interacting with the protein, or you can be deeply inside the cleft and vertical, or you can be deeply inside the cleft and vertical, horizontal, sorry. Right. And so, I mean, I decided to go, that was somehow a crude study, because I didn't scroll over all the docking possibilities, all the scoring function, and I took one that I wanted to try out with, and then I did a refinement with interaction energy, basically. And I also made choices myself to not take the conformation that I found looked weird for some reason, and the conformation that I found looked weird were the ones that were outside the pocket and predicted to be strongly binding and outside the pocket, and I was not interested to see the effect of the ligand that was interacting with the surface. I wanted to see the effect of the ligand bound into the active site of ivermectin.
Okay. Maybe fun.
So much discussion. Some of my questions went by already. So yeah, I mean, I'm not working on this specific type of protein, but I enjoyed reading the manuscript. It was clear, and I really enjoyed the talk too. I would join my colleague in saying that we're not there to have simulation replacing experiment. I think we are all clear on that. And as Munir said, I mean, it's very, very interesting what you observe, but the crystal structure really helped you validate. Yes. So if you didn't know that you were converging, when you don't know the answer, it's easy when when the MD gives you something that agrees with experiments, it's easy to say that MD can replace the experiment, but the truth is when you don't have the experimental value, often you have many choices. And I think we've all been confronted to that, and we all want so I think a little bit of caution is that doesn't take any away from your result. So I had some questions. So like Mark, I struggled a little bit with the description of your protonation state. I realized that you did it with Poisson-Boltzmann and that in your setup, in the end, I found this true. You have a low dielectric slab, but what I found was bizarre a little bit from my point of view in your setup was you said you do mole probability to check the sidechain orientation after the Poisson-Boltzmann. But and so could you comment on this? Because what do you see that could be a problem with that?
Yeah, but I think it's a mistake, I think.
It's a mistake in the writing, or it's a mistake doing it?
No, I think it's a mistake in my writing. I think I've done that 2 years ago, so I don't quite remember, but yeah, it doesn't make much sense to do it after the PK calculation.
So we all agree with
that. Yeah.
Okay. So I also had, I think we discussed about the conversion, so I will not be as long as my colleagues. I have a question pertaining to your slide 47.
On a tous beaucoup apprécié la discussion, votre travail. On tient à souligner que la discussion c'est fait pour être animée, mais tout le monde a beaucoup apprécié ce que vous avez fait. Félicitations de notre part à tous.
Merci.
Bravo.
Félicitations aux parents. Félicitations aux parents. Ils y sont pas pour moi. Monsieur, oui, j'ai trop fait. Félicitations. Très beau. Ça fait.
Merci d'être là, et puis encore remercier Nicolas aussi de venir boire un verre avec nous, c'est très sympa. Et puis, enfin, une thèse, ça se fait jamais tout seul, et c'est hyper difficile, peut-être plus que ce que j'avais estimé au départ. Et du coup, voilà, merci à tous ceux qui m'ont aidé, qui m'ont appris, qui m'ont soutenu quand c'était pas facile. Santé.
À ta santé.
Merci à toi.
Et vous pouvez vous jeter sur la nourriture.
Qu'est-ce que t'as dit?
Je peux me barrer.
Donc, chère famille et chers amis, voici quelques mots en l'odeur de notre Nico qui achève aujourd'hui ses 9 ans d'études. 9 ans et demi d'études. Juin 2014, ivre, il annonce à sa petite amie qu'il souhaite faire une thèse en chimie théorique. En réalité, la recherche était une fin en soi pour un garçon si curieux qui s'intéresse à tout et qui explique tout.
Tu l'as écrit avant le discours de Marco.
Mais je tenais à le dire, parce que bon, son rêve était de faire avancer la science et je crois bien qu'il en est toujours de même aujourd'hui. Septembre 2014, il débute sa thèse à l'ISIS dans une équipe de recherche alliant sérieux et décontraction. Vous prendrez des contractions
et beaucoup de
dans le
choses.
sens que vous voudrez. Hein. Et too many breaks, guys.
Ouais.
Je répète son sujet de thèse pour les absents de ce matin ou pour les personnes présentes qui n'ont rien compris. Allosteric modulation of pentameric ligand-gated ion channels from the jiggling of atoms to pharmacological strategies. Voilà. Son doctorat aura duré 3 ans durant lesquels il a fait preuve de beaucoup de courage et de détermination. Dans les moments difficiles, il citait le film Dick et Nick. Mon Dieu, le soleil se lève un peu plus en toi, et si tu te lèves pas, il en a rien à foutre. Ces 3 ans de thèse furent aussi intenses, voire plus que sa première année de pharma. Là déjà, il travaillait dur, buvait beaucoup de thé, et refusait de descendre acheter du pain de peur de rater son concours. À cette époque, c'est sa maman qui le soutenait avec douceur et bienveillance. Durant son doctorat, il aura également connu de grandes joies avec, par exemple, une publication dans un journal scientifique reconnu.
Lequel
Nature.
Ouais, non, si, Nature, c'était ça.
Géo.
Nature géographique.
Profil. De plus, il est devenu président de l'association des doctorants et des docteurs d'Alsace, la DAL. D'ailleurs, vivement que les tartes flambées soient servies, parce que je pense que nous avons tous la DAL.
En plus, tu l'avais jamais faite celle-là. Jamais.
Partout où il va, on admire ses talents d'orateur et son intelligence. Il a notamment suscité des vocations dans l'associatif. Lors des doctorales, séminaires aidant à préparer son avenir professionnel, ses pairs l'ont qualifié de leader. Ce doctorat lui aura également permis de parler un anglais fluent et d'apprendre des bases d'allemand. Par exemple, il sait dire « Il kirch Grafenstaden » en
ya. Et je sais aussi dire... Ah non, ça c'est de l'espagnol. Je me sens une David Wozniak.
20 décembre 2017. Sa soutenance passait brillamment, j'avais aussi écrit avant. Il s'agit de parler d'avenir. Les 2 thèses, c'est fait. Le Pax, c'est fait. Le bébé, c'est fait. Il ne te reste plus qu'à trouver le travail que tu mérites, à continuer d'être un passionné et de ne jamais cesser d'être heureux.
Coucou,